Australians gather at Anzac Day dawn services to honour those who served our country.
We gather today on ground made hallowed by Australian sacrifice.
Five teenagers charged over the church stabbing attack in southwest Sydney. Police clash with protesters at universities across America as tensions over the war in Gaza escalate. And runaway military horses cause chaos in central London. Hello and welcome to Mornings on ABC News. I'm Dan Borscher, coming to you from the lands of the Gadigal people. Taking a look at the weather in the capital cities. In Brisbane, partly cloudy with a top of 27. For Sydney and Canberra, mostly sunny. In Melbourne, a shower or two and 16. Cloudy and 15 for Hobart. In Adelaide and Perth, partly cloudy. And Darwin, mostly sunny, reaching 34 degrees. Australians have gathered for Anzac Day dawn services across the country, coming together to remember those who served and fought for the country. From the Australian War Memorial in Canberra and capital cities to the smallest of communities, veterans, their families and the public marked the Gallipoli landings in 1915 and commemorated all Australians who have served in the armed forces.
We honour and remember the more than 102,000 Australians who gave their life in service to our country. Their sacrifice has safeguarded our freedom, lest we forget.
It is also the time we acknowledge that we have a duty as a society to support those who have lost loved ones to war and its aftermath, and as each death leaves a trail of human heartbreak. We also have a responsibility to embrace our wounded veterans of all conflicts, some of whom are only just coming to terms with how their service has altered the path of their lives and those of their families.
We know how many Australians have died in the service of our country, but we do not know how many grieve each Anzac Day. How many are grieving amongst us today? I ask you all to hold in your hearts those who mourn on Anzac Day. And remember those whose service left them wounded in body, mind, or spirit.
Tributes began in New Zealand with thousands remembering those that have contributed to the New Zealand Army Corps. The Prime Minister is marking Anzac Day in Papua New Guinea after completing a two-day journey along the Kokoda Track. Laying a wreath alongside PNG Prime Minister James Marape, Mr Albanese paid his respects to those who fought.
Today we thank all serving members of the Australian Defence Force. The world changes. The battle and the battlefield moves. But because of their courage, the cause of peace remains, and hope for it lives on. Now, as darkness begins to lose its grip on the land, we think of those nights that must have seemed without end, here and across continents, across wars, across generations. And we give thanks that because of them, we can await what they made possible, the gift of a brighter dawn.
And Federal Opposition Leader Peter Dutton has spoken at a service in Brisbane.
On Anzac Day, we acknowledge the deeds of all Australians who have served in wars, conflicts and peacekeeping operations throughout our history. On this sacred day, we honour the memories of the more than 103,000 Australians who made the ultimate sacrifice. We remember them so that we don't forget who we are, the people who choose courage over cowardice, camaraderie over tribalism, endeavour over indolence, gratitude over resentment, and national pride over national aversion.
Dawn services are just wrapping up in Western Australia, with tens of thousands of people gathering at the state's War Memorial in Perth's Kings Park. Reporter Courtney Withers joins us now from there. Courtney, this year's service was more traditional than in previous years.
Well, good morning to you, Dan. It's a beautiful site here at Perth's Kings Park, overlooking Perth's Swan River, and the perfect site for reflection and remembrance this morning. The sun has just risen, and people here behind me, you can see, are laying their own personal wreaths after the end of the dawn service, which did just wrap up just a few minutes ago. It kicked off at about 5:30 local time, and many other regional and local RSL events happened across WA as well. But this is the main event at the State Memorial at Kings Park. Here I'm standing this morning. Now, as you touched on before, this year's service was a bit more traditional than previous years. The RSL spoke to me yesterday and they said they wanted to go back to the roots of the service's history and reflect services similar to the 1930s. So they added back in the singing of hymns this year and the reading of poems and commemorative readings as well. They said they haven't done this in the past few years, but they wanted to go back to basics with the service's roots and reflect that in the service this morning. There were lots of politicians present, and in the front row, Premier Roger Cook was here, Opposition Minister Libby Mettam, the Perth Lord Mayor Basil Zemplis, and Senator Michaelia Cash was in the front row as well, all of them laying wreaths and paying their own respects as well. But many people here, Dan, you can see, are gathering just in front of that memorial behind me, laying their own wreaths and paying their own respects.
Yeah, and Courtney, what's planned for Perth's Anzac Day march a little later?
Well, John, the Anzac Day March is set to kick off in just under a few hours, and it will see 62,000 veterans march through the city of Perth, and they end up at Perth's Langley Park, which overlooks Perth's Swan River on the Esplanade. And many veterans will be walking with medals and rosemary on their jackets with family members. Now, one of the veterans that's walking this morning is 105-year-old Arthur Leggett. He is WA's last surviving prisoner of war. Now, he wasn't at the dawn service this morning. I think rightfully so. When you're 105, you don't have to come to the dawn service. A little bit early for him, but he will be at the march today. And we spoke to him earlier this morning, and he said it's such an honour to be representing all of the prisoners of war across WA who didn't make it home or have now sadly passed. He said it's a huge honour, and he's really looking forward to that march this morning. Another interesting element of the march in Perth this morning is that for the first time, women from the Army, Air Force and Navy will be marching all together. They haven't done this before in the march's history, and they said they're doing this to stand together in solidarity. But Dan, a beautiful morning so far of reflection and remembrance here at Perth's Kings Park.
Courtney Withers reporting from Perth. And people are lining the streets in Melbourne's CBD for this year's Anzac Day March. Reporter Leanne Wong is there and joins us now. Leanne, this year's commemorations are focused on the country's peacekeepers.
That's right, Dan. Well, Melbourne's Anzac Day March is well underway behind me, and this year's commemorations indeed have a special focus on Australia's peacekeeping efforts, recognising the service of 70,000 Australians who've served in critical humanitarian missions all across the world, and many of whom are in fact leading this year's Anzac Day March. It is quite a beautiful, if chilly day here in Melbourne, but that hasn't stopped thousands of people from lining Swanston Street as well as St Kilda Road, watching this march make its way down through Melbourne CBD, where it will end up at the Shrine of Remembrance, where this morning about 40,000 people gathered for this year's dawn service. Now, about 10,000 people are expected to take part in this year's march, and some march ambassadors include RAAF veteran Brett West, as well as former Army medic Francine Dudfield. We've also seen veterans who've served in conflicts all over the world in dozens of different regiments and battalions march and make their way down through Melbourne as the state stops to remember those who have served in all global conflicts, as well as pay their respects to those who continue to serve. Dan.
Leanne Wong reporting from Melbourne. Thousands have gathered in Sydney as servicemen and women march through the heart of the city. Reporter Ethan Ricks is on Elizabeth Street, where at the front of the march, where he's joining us from now. Ethan, today's service comes during a very difficult time for New South Wales.
It certainly does, Dan. But the RSL hopes that services like the march here today through the heart of Sydney's CBD provides an opportunity for the state and for the country to come together and really embrace the true Anzac spirit, which means endurance, good humour and mateship, all the things that the Anzacs have become famous for over so many years of service. More than 10,000 veterans and servicemen and women are marching today. There's also, like you can hear, about 40 bands who are also playing in today's march. It's expected to take 3 hours through Elizabeth Street, then they'll make their way to the Anzac Memorial at Hyde Park South. You can see some of the cars carrying some of the older veterans coming through now, some of the favourites here who have lined the streets. Many people have travelled far and wide to come and pay their respects and say thank you to the people who have served their country. Talked to a family who came from Tamworth. We talked to some other families as well who are representing their loved ones who have lost their lives and since passed and who have served their country too. They say this is a proud day where they can represent their family and make sure everyone remembers what they sacrificed for their country. You can still see some of those cars coming through now, plenty of people clapping, some of those veterans waving outside the taxi windows. There's still a long way to go, still 3 hours, but they're making their way to through Elizabeth Street now. Dan?
Ethan Ricks reporting from Sydney. The Governor-General is urging Australians to pause and reflect on the impact of those that have served today. Here's part of his address to the nation.
On Anzac Day, we acknowledge those who have chosen to serve in our name and follow in the steps of our Anzac forebears. We acknowledge that they and their families disproportionately bear the cost of maintaining our freedoms and way of life. We honour them and give thanks. We remember and reflect.
And you can listen to that full message from the Governor-General tonight before 7 p.m. on ABC News and ABC iView. Well, thousands of First Nations people have served in the Australian military, but their stories have not always been recognised. From World War II to peacekeeping operations in East Timor and the Solomon Islands, the Moffat family have stood proud to protect and serve their country over 4 generations. In Albury, New South Wales, on Wiradjuri country, Indigenous Affairs reporter Tani Jash spoke with the Moffat family in the lead-up to Anzac Day. And a warning, the following report contains images and names of people who have died.
Proud Bidjigal man Ethan Moffat is an Army combat engineer on his second tour in the Solomon Islands.
It's good being here, knowing that you're having a good effect in helping the Solomon Islands people.
Ethan knew from a young age he wanted to walk in his father's footsteps.
The morals and the values that he holds, I believe, comes from the 27 years of service that he did.
Hello.
Finally got a hold of you.
Ethan's dad, retired Warrant Officer Class 2, Darren Moffat, says the military is like another big family.
It's like being on a big football team for me. So these are mine.
Darren served in one of Australia's largest peacekeeping operations in East Timor in 1999. He went on to train new recruits.
And privileged position to be able to turn a civilian into a soldier at the end of the day. This is the wreath I'm going to lay on Anzac Day, so I'm just building the wreath up with gum leaves and gum nuts. Blue represents the smoke.
A stolen generation survivor, Darren's grandfather, Harold James Stewart, fought on the front lines of Bougainville and New Guinea. But many of the equal conditions First Nations people experienced in the military did not continue when they returned home.
I think blackfellas weren't even able to join the RSL back in those days, so he had nowhere to go to and there was no counselling. He just dealt with it in his own way, being a religious man.
On Wiradjuri country, on the border of New South Wales and Victoria, Darren's mother Sandra's home is filled with photos of her family heroes.
I'm very proud of them for stepping up.
Sandra's husband Neville was a medic in the Navy for more than 20 years, serving in Vietnam and the Gulf War, while she was at home with their 2 kids.
You marry that person. You don't sort of marry his job and then you realise that you're in this too.
Standing proud this Anzac Day, Darren is representing First Nations servicemen and women.
Both my grandfathers, my father's service in the Navy, my service and my son's service in the Army. So I think it's important that the recognition is there, and I feel privileged that I can do that.